V been a dock worker at Helix Station for 11 years. 11 years of loading cargo manifests, signing off on quarantine checks, watching freighters come and go from 17 different star systems. 11 years of listening to the hum of the station's atmospheric processors and smelling that particular mix of recycled air and machine oil that nobody ever quite gets used to, but everyone eventually stops noticing. I've seen a lot of things on this station. I've seen a Keth merchant try to smuggle 60 live beetles in a pressurized wine crate. I've seen a Vral diplomat slip and fall face first into a fountain on the commercial deck, then get up and pretend nothing happened with the kind of dignity that only a 7-foot amphibian can manage after a face plant. I've seen a supply hauler pilot show up so drunk, she walked into the docking bay blast door 3 times before someone helped her through it. But I have never in 11 years seen anything like what happened on the 16th of 2nd month, in the docking bay designated Sector 4, Bay 9. And I want to tell you about it. Not because I think you'll believe me at first, not because it makes for a fun story at the pub, although it absolutely does. I want to tell you because I think it matters. Because I think what happened that day in that bay, in front of maybe 30 witnesses, was the moment I truly understood something that everyone in the galaxy talks about but very few people actually grasp. There's a law. Not a law that anyone wrote down in a treaty book or voted on in a council chamber. It's older than that. Much older. It's the kind of law that gets passed down in the oral histories of every spacefaring civilization, from the Keth who have been among the stars for 9,000 years, to the Vral who reached orbit maybe 600 years ago and have been integrating into the wider galactic community ever since. The law is simple. Never provoke humans. Now, before I tell you what happened, let me give you some context, because I think that matters too. Humans, and I say this as one, were the last major species to reach the stars in this arm of the galaxy. We showed up to the galactic community about 90 years ago, loud, confused, asking questions that made the older species uncomfortable, bringing with us an absolute carnival of competing factions, political philosophies, religious traditions, and opinions about the right way to cook protein. The first Keth diplomatic vessel that encountered a human ship didn't know what to make of us. They sent their standard first contact greeting package, a mathematical sequence that all spacefaring civilizations in the community had agreed upon centuries earlier as a universal signal of peaceful intent. The human ship responded with the mathematical sequence. And then the human captain came on visual and said, "Great, you got our message. Now do you guys have a doctor on board? We've got 3 crew members with something that looks like a rash, and our medical officer wants a second opinion." The Keth spent 4 hours trying to figure out if this was some kind of elaborate negotiating tactic. It wasn't. Turns out Lieutenant Reeves really did have a rash. Allergic reaction to the new uniform fabric, apparently. That was us. That's how we arrived. In the years that followed, the galactic community learned a few things about humans. We were adaptable, extremely so. We could eat almost anything, breathe almost anything, survive in almost any temperature range that wouldn't immediately kill us. We got sick and recovered. We broke bones and healed. We were, biologically speaking, annoyingly resilient. We were also emotional in ways the older species found deeply unpredictable. The Keth communicated primarily through structured logical statements. The Vral operated by strict hierarchical protocols. The Dorith, the oldest civilization currently active in the community, communicated through chemical signals that could take hours to fully transmit a complex idea. Humans talked constantly, changed their minds, argued with each other, formed strong attachments, and then argued some more. We were, by the standards of most species, absolutely chaotic. But the law, the real law, the one that mattered, didn't come from our biology or our communication style. It came from what happened the first time someone decided to test us. That was 63 years ago, before my time. Before most living humans' time, actually. It was a species called the Murath. The Murath were a militarized civilization, very established, very organized, and under the impression that the galactic community was theirs to order around as they pleased. They'd been doing it for centuries. Small civilizations paid tribute. Weaker ones stepped aside. The Murath called it galactic maintenance. Everyone else called it extortion, but nobody was strong enough to push back. Until the humans arrived. The Murath did what they always did. They showed up at a human colony on the frontier, made their demands, and waited for the humans to comply. The humans said no. The Murath escalated. And then something happened that the Murath, and frankly, most of the galaxy had not anticipated. The humans didn't fight defensively. They didn't retreat to protect their colony and hope the Murath got bored and went away. They didn't negotiate from a position of fear. They mobilized all of them, every ship, every soldier, every engineer turned weapons designer, every scientist put to work on the problem. And then they went straight at the Murath, hard and fast, with a ferocity that the older species still talk about in hushed tones. The war lasted 3 years. The Murath fleet, which had been the dominant military force in this arm of the galaxy for 2 centuries, was gone in 3 years. Not defeated, not pushed back, gone. The humans stopped when the Murath surrendered and agreed to a permanent treaty. They didn't annihilate them. They pulled back. They rebuilt. They went home. But the galaxy had seen something that it didn't forget. Humans, when pushed, didn't break. They broke you. And that was when the law got formalized, not in any treaty, but in the cultural memory of every species that watched what happened to the Murath. Every captain's briefing. Every diplomatic orientation packet. Every military academy and trading house and frontier outpost from here to the outer spiral had some version of the same line written somewhere. Never provoke humans. Not because humans were the biggest, not because they had the most advanced technology, not because they had the most ships. Because when you provoked them, they didn't respond proportionally. They responded completely. I know all of this because I've read the history. I've talked to the older crew members on this station. I've had long conversations, over bad coffee in the workers' lounge, with a Keth named Sethri who's been in trade for 40 years and has met more humans than most of her species. Sethri put it this way once. She said, your people have a switch. Most species, when threatened, calculate, weigh options, consider retreat, assess casualties. Your people have a switch, and when someone flips it, all of that stops. The calculation ends, and what's left is just... She paused for a long moment, her secondary eyelids blinking slowly in that way Keth do when they're searching for words. Just intention. I asked her what she meant by intention. She said, complete, undivided, total intention to deal with the threat. Not to survive the threat, not to outlast it, to end it. I sat with that for a while. And then I thought about my grandfather, who'd served in the merchant marine for 30 years and once, according to family legend, held off 3 armed pirates on a docking platform in the outer reaches with nothing but a cargo hook and a truly extraordinary willingness to use it. Maybe Sethri had a point. Anyway, that's the background, that's the context you need. Now let me tell you about Bay 9. Part 2, the arrival. It started as a routine day. If you've never worked on a mid-sized space station, let me paint you a picture. Helix Station is what you'd call a crossroads facility. We're not military, not primarily commercial, not a colony hub. We're the kind of place where ships stop to refuel, resupply, do minor repairs, exchange cargo, and sometimes just sit for a day or 2 while their crews decompress. We get freighters, passenger liners, independent traders, the occasional diplomatic vessel, and more frequently since the treaty expansions of the last decade, ships from species we don't know all that well yet. Bay 9 was scheduled that morning for the arrival of a Vren military escort vessel. I'll pause here because I suspect some of you don't know who the Vren are. The Vren are relatively new to the galactic community, newer even than humans by about 15 years. They came in with a lot of noise and a lot of confidence. Their ships were impressive. Their military had a reputation for discipline and controlled, methodical force. Their diplomatic corps was sharp and well-organized. But they had a problem. They had a cultural blind spot about humans. Most of the older species had been around long enough to have absorbed the lesson of the Murath. The Vren hadn't. They'd arrived after that war. They knew the history, technically. It was in their briefing documents, their diplomatic orientation materials, their military training. But knowing something on paper and actually feeling the weight of it in your gut are 2 very different things. The Vren, as a civilization, had never seen a human lose. And there were factions within their military who had started quietly to wonder if the whole never provoke humans thing was perhaps a bit overstated, a legend that had grown in the telling, the kind of warning that old species gave to new ones to keep them in line. You see where this is going. The escort vessel came in at 8:40 station time. I was on the floor of Bay 4, 2 bays over, running a manifest check on a Keth cargo hauler. Big ship. Smelled of that algae compound Keth use as a packing material, sort of a cross between old seaweed and engine coolant. Not unpleasant, actually, once you've been around it long enough. I could hear the Vren ship's docking thrusters from where I was standing. They use a different thruster configuration than most ships, wider spread, lower frequency. So you get this deep, resonant vibration in the floor rather than the usual sharp hiss of atmospheric braking. Felt it in my boots. The Vren were transporting what they called an agricultural technology consultation team. 12 specialists in hydroponic farming systems, coming to meet with a human agritech company whose representatives were already aboard the station. That was the official story, at least. What they were actually doing was a little more complicated, but I didn't know that yet. I was signing off on a crate of Keth textile samples when I heard the first alarm. Not the loud, blaring emergency alarm. The station has about 11 different alarm tones, ranging from mild inconvenience to everyone find a pod right now. What I heard was somewhere in the middle, the sustained two-tone pulse that means security event, secondary priority. Something that needs attention but isn't yet an emergency. I looked up. Around me, a few other dockworkers were doing the same thing. Marco, who works Bay 7 and has been on this station even longer than me, lowered his cargo scanner and looked at me across a stack of sealed containers. He raised his eyebrows. I raised mine back. We didn't say anything. We just started walking toward Bay 9. By the time I got there, maybe 4 minutes had passed, and the situation had already developed in a direction I hadn't expected. The Vren vessel was fully docked, ramp down, umbilical connected. The 12-member consultation team had disembarked, along with a security detail that was, by my count, not 12 people but closer to 30. 30 armed Vren soldiers on a routine docking stop, standing in formation, and at the end of the bay ramp, blocking their exit from the docking area, were 4 people. 4 humans. 3 of them were station security. I knew 2 of them by name, Akaffer, who ran the security checkpoint on our shift, and Reyes, who was one of the senior officers on the Alpha team. Both of them were standing in a way that I'd come to recognize over the years as a specific kind of professional stillness. Not tense, not aggressive, just very, very present. The 4th human was not a security officer. His name, I learned later, was Specialist First Class Darian Voss. He was stationed aboard the UHLS Meridian, a human light escort ship that happened to be docked on the other side of the station undergoing a routine systems check. He'd been off duty. He'd apparently heard the secondary alarm and come to see what was going on. He was in civilian clothes, dark cargo pants, a gray work shirt, the kind of boots you wear when you're planning to spend a long day on your feet. No uniform, no visible weapon. He was standing slightly in front of the 3 security officers, and he was looking at the 30 Vren soldiers the way you might look at a complicated piece of machinery that you're trying to figure out. I found out the sequence of events later, pieced together from the security footage, from what Akaffer told me over a meal 3 days afterward, and from what Voss himself apparently told the station commander in his incident debrief. Here's what happened. When the Vren vessel docked, the ramp came down and the consultation team emerged first, the 12 specialists, as per the manifest. So far, normal. Security was ready to escort them through processing and to their assigned meeting rooms. Then the soldiers emerged. Not just the 4 or 6 you'd expect as a standard escort for a diplomatic delegation. 30, in full combat armor, armed with Vren pulse lances, heavy weapons, the kind you use for area suppression. The kind that, on a space station, are a very bad idea to fire because of what they do to hull integrity. Akaffer had stepped forward and very calmly said that the weapons would need to be checked in at the security desk before entry to the station proper. Standard regulation. The station had a policy: all visitors were allowed sidearms for personal protection, but heavy weapons required secured storage. The Vren commanding officer, a sub-commander whose name translates roughly to Jivith Tar, told Akaffer that his soldiers would not be surrendering their weapons. Akaffer had then also very calmly explained that this was non-negotiable, not a request, station policy. Jivithtar had then drawn himself up to his full height. Vren are tall, around 6.5 feet, with that distinctive elongated neck and angular jaw, and told Akaffer in common galactic standard that this vessel operated under Vren military command and was not subject to civilian station policies. And then, as if to underline his point, he'd given a short gesture to his soldiers, and the 30 Vren had cycled their weapons, not pointed them at anyone, just cycled them. The mechanical sequence that activates the charging mechanism, readies the power cell, and produces a very specific sound that everyone in a militarized galaxy knows means we are prepared to use these. Akaffer, Reyes, and the 3rd security officer, a woman named Park, had not moved. And that was the moment Voss arrived. I want to try to describe what it was like from where I was standing, because the security footage is clinical and it doesn't capture the atmosphere of the bay. The bay was enormous. Bay 9 at Helix Station is one of the larger docking spaces, designed for mid-size vessels, with about 40 meters of open floor between the ship ramp and the exit corridor. The ceiling was maybe 25 meters up, all exposed structural rigging and lighting arrays. The floor had the standard grid of cargo tracks and tie-down points. The air always smells slightly metallic in the bays, from the fuel systems and the atmosphere scrubbers working overtime. There were maybe 30 other people scattered around the bay at the time, other dockworkers, a couple of maintenance crew, a pair of Keth freight handlers who were at the far end, and had frozen completely still in that particular Keth manner that means I am going to become part of the wall and hope no one notices me. I don't blame them. I was standing about 15 meters from the action, slightly to the left, behind a cargo pallet. I was not hiding behind the pallet on purpose. I had simply stopped moving and happened to be near a pallet. The bay was very quiet. That's the thing I remember most. This massive open space, normally full of equipment noise and worker chatter and the ambient sounds of a functioning docking facility, just quiet. Like the station itself was holding its breath. The 30 Vren soldiers were in a loose but clearly organized formation, fanned out on the ramp and the deck at the base of it. Their armor was that pale gray-green Vren military uses, with the banded plating along the shoulders and forearms. The pulse lances were long and angular, designed for two-handed use, and the sound of 30 of them cycling, that low, harmonic charge hum, was the kind of sound that bypasses your brain and goes straight to your spine. The 3 security officers were standing between the soldiers and the exit corridor, not close enough to be grabbed, far enough to have options, but in the way, clearly in the way. And Voss was standing in front of them. He wasn't doing anything dramatic. He wasn't striking a pose. He was just standing there with his hands slightly away from his sides, not raised in surrender, just not clenched, open, the posture of someone who is completely comfortable with where they are. He was looking at Jivithtar. Jivithtar was looking back at him. The subcommander said something in Vren first. Then, when Voss didn't react, he repeated it in galactic standard. "Move aside. This is a military operation. You are civilian. You have no authority here." Voss said, "I heard you the first time." Jivithtar's neck frill, the ridge of cartilage that Vren have along the back of their skull, which rises and spreads when they're agitated, went up about a centimeter. "Then move," he said. Voss looked at him for a moment. Just looked at him. Then he tilted his head very slightly to one side, like he was working something out. "No," he said. Just that, no, flat, even. No exclamation, no threat, no explanation attached to it. Just a single syllable delivered with the particular kind of calm that makes it land like something much heavier. I've thought about that moment a lot since then. I've thought about what it must have looked like from Jivithtar's perspective. He had 30 soldiers with charged weapons. He was a military officer with legitimate, or what he considered legitimate, authority. He was tall, armored, backed by an entire armed unit. And he was being told no by one human in civilian clothes, who didn't even look particularly angry. The sub-commander's frill went up further. "You are one person," he said. "We are 30. Voss nodded, genuinely nodded like he was acknowledging a fair point. "That's accurate," he said. "And if you bring those weapons into this station, there are going to be significantly more of me, and significantly fewer of you, so let's skip that part." There was a pause. Then Jivithtar said, "That is a threat." Voss seemed to consider this. "It's a description of what happens next if you make a bad decision. There's a difference. I want to be honest about something here, because I think it's important for understanding what came next." At this point in the situation, I was scared. I'm not ashamed to say that. 30 armed soldiers, charged weapons, a clearly escalating standoff in an enclosed docking bay. I was scared. My heart was doing something technically impressive inside my chest, and I was very aware of the fact that if someone pulled a trigger in that bay, the physics of what would happen next were not kind to anyone present. And yet, Voss didn't look scared. I don't mean he was putting on a show. I've seen people pretend to be calm when they're not, the way their jaw gets very tight, the way they breathe too carefully, the way their stillness is actually a kind of rigid control. That's not what this was. He looked like he was having a slightly tedious administrative dispute. Like he'd mentally calculated the situation, found it manageable, and was now simply waiting for the other party to realize what he'd already realized. I don't know if that's training. I don't know if it's personality. I know that it was the most genuinely terrifying thing I saw that day, and I watched a sub-commander of the Vren military back down. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Part 3, the escalation. What happened next took about 45 seconds, and I'm going to walk you through it carefully because the timeline matters. At approximately 8:52 station time, Jivithtar signaled to 4 of his soldiers, the 4 at the front of the formation, closest to Voss. They stepped forward. Not aggressive movement, controlled, the kind of motion that communicates we are now taking action without yet being outright hostile. Voss didn't step back. He watched the 4 soldiers advance, and then he said to the air very casually, "Control, are you seeing this?" A voice came back from his earpiece. I could just barely hear it from where I was. Station dispatch, confirming visual from bay cameras. Voss said, "Log it, and send a courtesy ping to the Meridian." That last part, send a courtesy ping to the Meridian, is what made Jivithtar hesitate. Because the Meridian was a human military vessel. Not a large one, not a destroyer or a fleet ship. A light escort. But it was present, it was crewed, and it was capable of a response in under 10 minutes. Jivithtar didn't hesitate long, but the hesitation was there and Voss saw it. "How many ships do you have in the system?" Voss asked. He already knew the answer, 1 vessel, the one docked in Bay 9. But he was asking it in the way you ask a question when you want the other person to hear themselves answer it. Jivithtar said nothing. "Right," said Voss. "And how many do you think arrive when a human ship sends a contact plus log to its command channel?" This was, I want to emphasize, a bluff, or at least a very significant exaggeration. The Meridian had companions in the sector, but not in immediate range. A call for backup would have taken hours, maybe longer, for anything significant to arrive. But here's the thing about the law. Never provoke humans isn't just a tactical warning. It's a statement about momentum, about what happens once the switch gets flipped. Jivithtar, if he'd studied his history, knew that the issue wasn't whether he could win this standoff right now. The issue was what came after, what you called down on yourself and your people and your ships by making the wrong move in a docking bay on Helix Station on a Tuesday morning. And Voss was making sure that was the thing Jivithtar was thinking about. I need to tell you about the soldiers, because they're not all Jivithtar. The 30 Vren military personnel in that bay were not a monolith. They were individual beings, most of them young, many of them on their first extended deployment. They'd been told what to do and they were following orders, as soldiers do. But soldiers are also people, and people read situations. I was watching their body language from behind my pallet, and I could see it shifting. The front 4 who had stepped forward had stopped. They hadn't been told to stop. Jivithtar hadn't given a new order, but they weren't advancing either. There was something in the way they were holding their weapons that had changed. The certainty had gone out of it. The physicality of the action had changed from we are executing a plan to we are waiting to see what happens. Toward the back of the formation, one of the younger soldiers had turned slightly toward the one next to him. I couldn't hear what they said, but it was a question. You could tell by the angle of the head, the slight lean. The back of the formation was reassessing. Voss somehow noticed this too, or he'd anticipated it. Because what he said next wasn't addressed to Jivithtar at all. He looked past the sub-commander, past the front rank, and spoke to the formation generally. "You're a long way from home," he said. His voice was conversational, not loud, just clear. "We know that. This isn't an easy posting and nobody's looking for a problem. What we are looking for is compliance with the station's weapons policy, which exists to protect everybody in this bay, including you." He paused. "Check your Vren military briefing documents. Section 4, Galactic Community Integration Protocols. Helix Station is a Class B neutral facility. Heavy weapons require secured storage during dock. That's not a human rule. That's a community rule that your government signed." Another pause. "Your sub-commander knows this. I suspect he's made a decision today that he's going to want to reconsider." Jivithtar's frill was at maximum extension now, the full spread, which on a Vren indicates something between extreme agitation and genuine threat response. His primary hands were very tight on his own sidearm. He said through what sounded like carefully controlled effort, "You are a civilian. You have no standing here." "That's true," Voss agreed. "So let me stand aside and let my colleagues, who do have standing, and are also not going to move, have this conversation. We can all get where we're going a lot faster that way." He stepped to the left, out of the center of the corridor, and gestured slightly to Akafar. Akafar stepped forward. What followed was about 15 minutes of negotiation that I partially watched and partially absorbed secondhand. The short version: Akafar, who turned out to be extraordinarily good at her job, walked Jivithtar through the exact text of the Community Weapons Protocol, the specific subsection that applied to Class B stations, the historical precedent for its enforcement, and the precise legal liability the Vren military would face if they violated it on a recorded contact log that had already been filed. She was not aggressive, she was not emotional, she was like a machine made of very specific and uncomfortable facts. Jivithtar pushed back 4 times. Akafar answered each pushback with another fact. At the end of 15 minutes, the 30 Vren soldiers had secured their pulse lances in the bay's weapons storage locker. They kept their sidearms as permitted. They were processed through the standard security checkpoint, and they proceeded, eventually, to their assigned meeting rooms. Jivithtar was the last one through the checkpoint. He stopped in front of Akafar and looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Voss, who was standing off to the side now, having apparently decided that his role in the situation was complete. The sub-commander said something in Vren. One of the junior officers translated. He says the records of this interaction will be reviewed by Vren Command. Akafar said, "We look forward to it." Jivithtar left. Part 4 after the bay. The bay went from silent to very loud in about 30 seconds after Jivithtar's back cleared the corridor entrance. Dockworkers who'd been frozen in position suddenly started moving and talking simultaneously. The 2 Keth freight handlers detached themselves from the wall they'd been pretending to be part of and went back to their cargo, moving with the deliberate briskness of people who want to look like they were working the whole time. Marco appeared next to me. He looked slightly pale under his station tan, which takes work to achieve. "You see that?" he said. "Yeah," I said. "The one in the front," he said. "The civilian." "Voss," I said. "How did he—" Marco started, then stopped, then tried again. "He wasn't even." "I know. He just— I know." Marco looked at the corridor entrance where the Vren had disappeared. "Those were pulse lances," he said. "Yes. And he just—" "Marco. Yeah. I know." We stood there for a moment. The bay noise was coming back up around us. The equipment hum, the air processors, the distant sound of another ship's thrusters firing somewhere on the outer ring. "I need a coffee," Marco said. "Yeah," I said, "me too." I found Voss about 20 minutes later in the bay workers' lounge on the mezzanine level. A small room with a coffee dispenser that made something technically described as coffee, 2 long tables, and a window overlooking the main concourse of the station's commercial deck. He was sitting at one of the tables with a cup of that technically coffee, looking at his personal comm and making notes on something. Off-duty posture, relaxed, the same casual energy that had apparently been sufficient to stall 30 armed soldiers. I got myself a coffee and stood near the window for a second, working up whether this was something I was going to do or not. Then I walked over and said, "Mind if I sit?" He looked up. He was younger than I'd expected. Mid-30s, maybe. Brown hair that needed cutting, dark eyes, a face that looked like it had spent a lot of time outdoors or in somewhere that counted as outdoors adjacent. A small scar along his jawline that looked old. "Go ahead," he said. I sat. We both drank bad coffee for a moment. "I was in the bay," I said. "I saw what happened." He nodded, didn't say anything. "The logging the contact," I said. "Pinging the meridian, was any of that real?" He looked at me for a second, assessing whether this was a question worth answering. Then he said, "The log was real, the ping was real, the implication of what would arrive was," he paused, "accurate enough." "Accurate enough," I repeated. "You can't bluff someone who's read their history," he said. All I had to do was make sure he was thinking about the history. I thought about that, but if he hadn't backed down... "He was always going to back down," Voss said. "It wasn't arrogant. It was the same way you'd say 2 + 2 is 4, factual, mildly boring, certain." "How did you know?" He set his coffee down and looked at the window at the people moving on the concourse below. "Because he'd already made the choice that told me, when he cycled those weapons but didn't raise them. That's not the move of someone who's committed to violence. That's the move of someone who's trying to create pressure to avoid violence. He didn't want to fight. He wanted compliance." He picked his coffee back up. So I made sure compliance with the station's rules was the easiest available path. I sat with that for a moment. "What if you'd been wrong?" I said. He considered this with what appeared to be genuine thoughtfulness. "Then," he said, "the situation would have gotten considerably noisier." He said it without any particular drama, just as a statement of fact, as if considerably noisier was a condition he'd mentally prepared for and filed away and moved on from. I thought again about what S. Sethry had told me, about the switch, about complete, undivided, total intention. I thought I understood it a little better now. Part 5, what the VRENN saw. I want to shift perspective for a moment, because I think it's important. I'm going to tell you what I was told later, pieced together from conversations with the Vren Jr. officer who stayed behind after Jivithtar left. A young man named Sarath Su who ended up eating a meal in the station cafeteria, and had a long conversation with one of our resident translators, a woman named Priya who's been working cross-species communications on Helix for 6 years. Priya told me what Sarath Su told her, which I'm going to do my best to reconstruct. Sarath Su said that from inside the Vren formation, the morning had looked like a manageable operation. They'd been briefed on the weapons policy. They knew it existed, but Jivithtar had been convinced, and had convinced the unit, that the policy would not be enforced. That a station with 3 security officers wouldn't meaningfully oppose 30 armed Vren military personnel. That it would be an uncomfortable few minutes and then compliance, and then they'd be through. He said the moment things changed for him personally was not Voss's words. It was the fact that Voss didn't move. Sarath Su said that when the 4 soldiers stepped forward, he watched Voss very carefully because in his experience, and he'd been in several high-pressure situations in his 2 years of service, people without combat training had a physiological response that was hard to fake. The weight shifted. The eyes widened slightly. The breathing changed. Voss's weight didn't shift. His eyes didn't widen. Sarath Su wasn't sure about the breathing because he was too far away, but the body language from the front rank said the same thing. Something in the human wasn't doing what bodies normally do when 30 armed soldiers stepped toward them. "In training," Priya told me Sarath Su had said, "they teach you to watch for this. The absence of fear response in an opponent tells you something. Either they are very experienced, or they have calculated that you are not as dangerous as you appear. Both of these things are bad for you." Sarath Su said there was a word in Vren military terminology that meant something like someone who has stopped calculating outcomes. Not someone reckless. Not someone who doesn't care about survival. Someone who has already processed the worst-case scenario so completely that it no longer affects their behavior in the present moment. The word, loosely translated, was something like settled. He said Voss looked settled. And he said that whatever Jivithtar had been expecting, nervousness, compliance, retreat, aggression, he hadn't been prepared for settled. There was no protocol for it. There was no established Vren military response to an opponent who simply had no discernible anxiety about the situation. "It is," Sarathu said to Priya, "like attempting to intimidate a wall." He thought about that for a second, then corrected himself. "Not a wall. Walls do not look at you. It is like attempting to intimidate something that is looking at you very calmly and is fully prepared for whatever comes next." Priya asked him how he felt about the situation now. He thought for a moment, then he said, "There is a briefing document about humans, about their history, about the law." Priya said, "Never provoke humans." He said, "Yes, I had read it, but I think perhaps I had not understood it. I think I understood it as a description of what humans do. Today I understood it as a description of what they are. I've been thinking about that distinction ever since. What they do versus what they are. Because those are different things. The Murath knew what humans did. They'd been warned. They had the intelligence reports. They chose to disbelieve the extrapolation, figured that their own capabilities were sufficient, that the warning was exaggerated, that the humans would back down. They were thinking about actions, tactics, capabilities. They weren't thinking about character. And character, it turns out, is the thing that doesn't change when circumstances change. Tactics can be countered. Capabilities can be matched. But character is what determines what happens at 2 a.m. when everything has gone wrong, and there's no good option left, and the only question is whether you keep going or you stop. Humans, apparently, and again, I'm saying this as one, have a character that includes a very specific response to being pushed. We push back, not because we're stupid, not because we don't understand risk, not because we haven't done the math. We push back because something in us, something old and deep and not entirely rational, refuses to accept the premise that we should move. The Vren that morning had pushed, and they'd found what everybody who reads their history already knew was there. Part 6, the investigation. Now I want to be clear, the situation didn't end in Bay 9. The Vren consultation team had their meetings. The 12 agricultural specialists met with the human agritech representatives for 2 days. The meetings were, by all accounts, perfectly functional and productive. But Jivithtar filed a formal complaint. He filed it with the station administration, with the Vren diplomatic channel, and with the Galactic Community's Cross-Species Relations Office. The complaint alleged that his military personnel had been improperly obstructed in the execution of their duties, that the weapons storage requirement had been applied selectively and unfairly, and that a civilian, Voss, had been allowed to operate in a capacity reserved for official security personnel. The station administration took the complaint seriously, which is to say they investigated it thoroughly and reached the conclusion that the station had followed protocol correctly in every respect. The Vren diplomatic channel took slightly longer, but the conclusion was the same. The Cross-Species Relations Office took longest of all, 3 weeks, full review, footage from every bay camera, statements from Akafer, Reyes, Park, Voss, and several of the dockworkers, including me and Marco. Statements from the Vren side, including Jivithtar and several of his officers. The final report was 412 pages. I've read about 60 of them, which I think gives me a reasonable grasp of the main findings. The key conclusion, buried somewhat in the administrative language of Section 9, but very clear once you decoded it. Jivithtar had violated the community weapons protocol by cycling his unit's weapons during what was classified as a procedural compliance interaction. The cycling of those weapons, that readying sound, that activation sequence, had constituted a threat gesture under the applicable definitions. He had, in other words, escalated first. He had provoked. The consequences were administrative, not military. Jivithtar was reassigned. The Vren government issued a formal apology to the station. The 3 security officers received commendations. Voss received a letter from the station commander thanking him for his assistance, which he apparently filed somewhere and forgot about. But the real consequence wasn't in the report. The real consequence was the thing that rippled out from Bay 9 over the following months. There is a network of communication among the species of the galactic community that moves faster than any official channel. It's not a secret network. It's just conversation, trade contacts talking to each other, diplomatic staff sharing notes over meals, military officers writing letters, crew members in transit lounges telling stories. Word of Bay 9 moved through that network the way things always move through it, imprecisely, emotionally, with the specific weight that real events carry over second-hand accounts. What people said wasn't a precise retelling of the facts. What people said was something simpler. A Vren military officer took 30 armed soldiers into a docking bay on Helix Station. One human in civilian clothes told them to stop. They stopped. That was the story. Just that. And what that story did, in Keth trading halls and Vral diplomatic corridors, and the mess rooms of Doroth long-range freighters, was remind people of something they already knew, but had perhaps let themselves forget. The law wasn't just about the Murath War. It wasn't just about fleets and battles, and the historical record of what happened to civilizations that went to war with humans. It was about this: a docking bay on a Tuesday morning, 3 security officers and 1 off-duty soldier in civilian clothes and 30 armed military personnel, and a choice about who was going to move. And what the law said, what it had always said, was that the human wasn't going to move. Not because of the meridian, not because of backup, not because of strategy or calculation or the careful assessment of available options. Because of what they are. Part 7, Conversations in the Dark. There are things that happen on a space station at 200 that don't happen at any other time. At 200, the commercial deck is quiet. The main transit corridors have a quarter of their daytime traffic. The lighting drops to 60%, an energy conservation measure that also has the effect of making the station feel smaller, more personal, less like an infrastructure facility and more like a place where people live. I work a long shift on Tuesdays, and when I finished the paperwork for the manifest discrepancy that had kept me late, I walked the long way back to the residential deck. Past the commercial concourse, past the observation lounge with its wide panels looking out at the dark, and the stars and the occasional distant blur of a ship in transit. I stopped at the observation lounge because I often do. There's a bench near the center panel, one of those old station furnishings that was clearly put there by someone who understood that sometimes people need to sit and look at the stars and not think about cargo manifests. As Sethri was there, she often is. She's a night person or night shift person, which is roughly the same thing. She sat in her usual spot with a cup of whatever warm beverage the Keth prefer, which looks like hot metal shavings suspended in gray water, but apparently tastes very good if you have the right kind of taste receptors. I sat down next to her. We sat there for a while not talking. We've known each other long enough to be comfortable with that. Then Sethri said, "I heard about Bay 9. "Yeah," I said, "most people have." "The soldier," she said. "The one who was off duty." "Was?" "They're saying he was not afraid." I thought about that. "He didn't look afraid," I said. "Whether he was afraid or not, I can't tell you." Sethri made a soft sound that in Keth signals something like, "Yes, I understand the distinction." "Your people are often afraid," she said. It wasn't an insult, it was just a statement. "In the historical records, in the accounts, the ones who acted with the most," she paused. "The ones who changed things most decisively, they were frequently very afraid." I looked at the stars. "That's probably true." "It is interesting," she said. "For Keth, fear is typically a signal to avoid action, a warning from the body that the risk is too high. We respect fear. We treat it as information. And for humans..." She was quiet for a moment. "For humans, based on everything I have observed and read and heard in 40 years, she tilted her head slightly. "For humans, fear is often a signal to act, a warning from the body that something important is at stake. You treat it as fuel." I didn't say anything. "That," she said, "is why the law exists." We sat with the stars for a while after that. I thought about what she said for a long time. Fear as information versus fear as fuel. I thought about the histories, not just the Murath War, but all of it. The moments where human history had turned on the decision of whether to stay or go, whether to fight or retreat, whether to hold the line or give ground. Humanity's history on Earth was not a peaceful one. We'd fought each other constantly, across thousands of years, across every continent, for every conceivable reason and some barely conceivable ones. We'd developed weapons of extraordinary destructive capability. We'd hurt each other badly and repeatedly. But we'd also survived things that should have killed us. Plagues and famines and ice ages and our own worst impulses. We'd survived them and then gotten up and built something new. There's a theory, I've heard it from a few different sources, human and otherwise, that the galactic community's worry about humans isn't primarily our aggression. It's our persistence. Lots of civilizations are aggressive. Lots have strong militaries and dominant phases and expansionist periods. What's rarer is the species that gets hurt and doesn't stop. That takes a loss and incorporates it instead of collapsing. That gets knocked down and asks, what do I learn from this, instead of how do I survive this? We're not the fastest learners. We're not the most logical. We're not the most emotionally stable or the most disciplined or the most strategically sophisticated. But we learn and we adapt, and we don't quit. And somewhere in the galaxy's collective memory, that combination, the aggression and the persistence and the refusal to quit, had produced the law. Never provoke humans. Not because it always ends badly for you today. Because it always ends badly for you eventually. Part 8, 6 months later. 6 months after the Bay 9 incident, I had occasion to meet Jeeveth Tar. Not in any official capacity, not in a diplomatic context, just at the station because he'd come back. This surprised a lot of people. It surprised me. The Vren weren't scheduled to have further business on Helix Station for another 8 months. But there he was, in civilian clothes this time, no military insignia, with a single aide, walking the commercial concourse like a tourist. Except that nobody who looks like Jeeveth Tar, 6.5 feet of angular, military-postured, neck-frilled Vren, blends in very well on a commercial concourse. I ran into him in, of all places, the small market on level 3 where the traders from different species sell specialty goods. I was there looking for a specific type of tea that comes in on the Keth freighters twice a month. He was looking at a display of human-crafted goods, small things, handmade items that some of the human crew bring to sell for supplemental income. Carved wood, woven textiles, that kind of thing. He was holding a small wooden figure, something one of the dockworkers' kids had made, a stylized human face, very simple, carved from a pale wood and finished with a natural oil. He saw me. I could tell he recognized me. We'd made eye contact in the bay briefly during the standoff. We looked at each other for a moment. Then he said in careful galactic standard, "You were in the bay." "Yes," I said. He looked at the wooden figure in his large hand. The scale was almost comical, this small, delicate carved thing held in a soldier's grip. "I have read the law," he said, "many times before, after." He set the figure down carefully. "I thought I understood it." I waited. "I understood it as a warning about war," he said. "About military capability, about the consequences of conflict." He looked at me. "In the bay," he said, "I understood something else." I said, "What?" He was quiet for a long moment. His frill, I noticed, was completely flat, the Vren equivalent of settled, calm, at rest. "The human who stood in the corridor," he said. "He was not there in an official capacity. He had no authority, no weapon, no backup immediately available." "No," I agreed. "He stayed anyway," Jeeveth Tar said. "Yes. Not because he was ordered to, not because it was his function, because he had," the sub-commander paused, searching for the word, "because he had decided." He looked at the carved wooden face again. "This is what the law is about," he said. "Not the fleet, not the weapons. The fact that one of them in civilian clothes, off-duty, having no obligation, decides that the correct thing is to stand there, and then stands there." He picked up the carved figure again and turned it in his hands. "Where I come from," he said, "authority flows from rank. If you have no rank in a situation, you have no authority, you do not act." He looked at me. "Your people do not operate this way." "No," I said. "Not always." "Authority for your people," he said slowly, like he was still working it out, "flows from the decision to act." I'd never heard it put exactly that way before. But I thought about Voss, standing in the corridor in his civilian clothes with no weapon and no official role, and I thought, yeah, that's about right. "You decided to buy the figure," I said. He looked at it one more time, then he handed it to me. "I thought," he said carefully, You might want to give it to the human, the one from the corridor. Then he turned and walked away down the concourse, tall and angular, his frill completely flat. I stood there holding the carved face of a stranger, trying to figure out what the last 3 minutes had meant. Part 9, what I believe. I gave the figure to Voss. Tracked him down through the station's crew directory. He was still aboard the Meridian, which had been extended at Helix for some additional systems maintenance. Left a message, met him at the workers' lounge where we'd talked before. He looked at the carved figure for a moment when I explained where it came from. Then he turned it over in his hands, the same way Jivithtar had. He said. I thought you'd want to know he came back, I said. Yeah, he said. He set the figure on the table between us. Good. I asked him, because I'd been wondering for 6 months, what he'd actually been thinking in the bay. What was going through his head while he was standing there in front of 30 armed soldiers. He thought about it for a while. Real thought, not a polished answer. He drank some of his coffee. He looked out the window at the concourse. Then he said, I was thinking about what happens next. What do you mean? I was thinking, he said, about what the situation looks like in 10 minutes, in an hour. Tomorrow, if they push through, what happens then? What call gets made? What ships come? What does this turn into? He looked at the carved figure. And I was thinking, none of that needs to happen. There's a step right here, right now, where this stops. And it stops cleanly and nobody gets hurt and both sides walk away and the situation never becomes the thing it could become. He paused. So I stood there, he said, because that was the step. Were you scared? I said. He looked at me sideways. I'm not going to tell you I wasn't because that would be dumb and also a lie. A slight smile. But fear's useful, makes you sharp, slows your thinking down just enough that you don't do something stupid. Fear as fuel, I said, remembering S. Sethry's words. He tilted his head. Who told you that? A Keth friend of mine. He nodded slowly. That's pretty accurate. We sat there for a minute. Then he picked up the carved figure and turned it over one more time. You know what's funny? He said. What? This is the oldest law in the universe, he said. Not just in the galaxy, the universe, because every civilization that ever reached the stars figured it out eventually by one method or another. He set the figure down. Never corner something that has nowhere to retreat to. Never challenge something that doesn't recognize when it should be afraid. Never push something that pushes back harder than it should, based on everything you thought you understood about how hard things push. He looked at me. The Vren knew the law, he said. They'd read it. They'd memorized it. But knowing and believing are different things. You don't really believe a law until you see the law in action. Bay 9, I said. Bay 9, he agreed. He left the carved figure on the table. Keep it, he said. Put it somewhere you'll see it. I looked at the small carved face, pale wood, simple lines, the kind of thing a child makes when they're learning to make things with their hands. A reminder of what? I said. Voss stood up, tucking his comm into his pocket, already in motion. He said it without looking back. That the step where it stops, he said, is always available if someone decides to stand in it. Part 10, the station goes on. The Meridian left Helix Station 11 days after that conversation. I watched it go from the observation lounge. Not specifically waiting for it, I happened to be there, the way I often am when the shift is done and I don't feel like going straight to sleep. The ship went through the departure sequence with the competence you'd expect of a military vessel. Clean separation, precise alignment to the transit corridor, the brief blaze of the main drives engaging, and then the compression of the jump field gathering around the hull like a wrinkle in the dark. And then it was gone, just stars where a ship had been. I thought about Voss somewhere out there, moving toward whatever came next in his particular story. Another station, another assignment, another Tuesday morning that might or might not turn into something that would echo outward through the conversation networks of the galaxy for months afterward. I thought about Jivithtar back on his home world or his new posting, turning over what had happened in Bay 9, reading the law again, understanding it differently this time. I thought about S. Sethry, probably in her usual spot in this same lounge 12 hours from now, drinking her gray water beverage and looking at stars she's been looking at for 40 years. I thought about the law. Not as a warning, not as a threat. as a description of something real. Here is what I've come to believe, after 11 years on Helix Station and one morning in Bay 9. Humans are not the strongest species in the galaxy. We are not the oldest. We are not the most logical or the most disciplined or the most technologically advanced. But we have something that the law recognizes and that other species are still learning to fully understand. We have the capacity to decide, not to calculate, not to strategize, not to assess probabilities and select the optimal response from a set of available options. To decide, to commit, to say this is the line and then stand on it. And what makes us dangerous, what has always made us dangerous, long before we ever reach the stars, is that when we decide, the decision is total. Not proportional, not measured, total. The Murath learned it. Jivathtar learned it. Every species that has tested the law has eventually learned it. Not because humans always win, not because we're invincible or because the math always comes out in our favor, but because when you push us, we don't stop at pushing back. We commit. We follow through. We stay in the fight not because we've calculated that it's worth it, but because something in us, something deep and irrational and maybe a little frightening, refuses to accept that not fighting is an option. And the galaxy, in its accumulated wisdom over 9,000 years of interstellar civilization, has decided that the correct response to this information is a law. Simple, clear, universal. Never provoke humans. Not because we're monsters. Because we're human. And that, as it turns out, is enough.